7. Do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I'm speaking to those who know the law, that...
So I think he's referencing the Jews at this point. When he's speaking to those who know the law, he's not talking about the law of the land, or he's talking about the spiritual law or the Jewish law. And this is after the death of Christ and before 70 AD. But he's still talking to the Jews about the law, the Jewish law.
That the law has authority over someone only as long as that person lives.
So I guess he's speaking in general terms. Maybe for any law, as I mentioned before, any law is only applicable to who it is given, and it is also only applicable to when you are alive. Because after you die, then that law is no longer applicable.
For example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive.
So here comes some good marriage legal advice. However, that's not the main point of this section, but it is a good passage to look at for marriage and divorce also.
But if her husband dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. So then, if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress.
And that would be the example where there is a divorce and a remarriage. And that's consistent with what the rest of the Bible teaches about marriage and divorce and remarriage. That you cannot divorce your spouse and marry someone else and it be acceptable. The only thing that breaks the bond of marriage is death. And you're not supposed to kill your spouse either. So it's a commitment. It's a lifelong commitment. And that vow and that law of marriage is applicable and binding for life. And what God has put together, let no man put asunder. So divorce is wrong, and remarriage results in adultery unless the original spouse is dead, and then you're no longer bound by the law of marriage to the dead person. And the reason he's bringing this up is because he's actually pointing out the relationship of the Jews to the Jewish law, the Mosaic law. And I remember a couple of chapters back I was struggling with how the Jews should respond to the obligation of the law, but I think chapter 7 answers it clearly, that when we become a Christian, even when a Jew becomes a Christian, you die to the old law, and they're no longer bound to that law.
But if her husband dies, she is released from that law and is not an adulteress if she marries another man. So, my brothers and sisters, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead.
So it's essentially looking at the Jewish relationship to their obligation under the law, the same as a marriage, that you are bound as long as you both live to keep the law. But in Christ, as a Christian, the Jews died to the old law so that they could be remarried to another, which would be to Christ and to the Messianic kingdom.
In order that we might bear fruit for God. For when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death.
So he says, when we were in the realm of the flesh. I think that's talking about just under the old covenant. The system of law was one of law-keeping and obedience, a law of commandments. There was no forgiveness or mercy under that system. there was no cleansing of sins. The sinful passions were aroused by the law that were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death. I'll leave it there for now.
But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code.
So this is a clear distinction between the difference of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. We have died to what bound us, which was the Old Covenant law, the Mosaic system of laws and commandments, the written code. And now we serve in the new way of the Spirit. So it's not about, and this was even spoken of and prophesied in the Old Covenant, that under this new system, that the law would not be written on tablets of stone, but it would be written on the heart. So now when we serve in the way of the Spirit, it has everything to do with your heart and your attitude, and nothing to do with the written code or the legalistic law-keeping thou shalt and thou shalt nots.
What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law.
So, Paul pointing out one of the primary blessings or positive aspects of the Old Covenant law, and that was to identify sin and to convict all under sin, so that all people would recognize their utter hopelessness and lost condition. Because when you are under a system of law-keeping and written code, everyone should recognize that you will utterly fail, that you cannot live up to the standard of perfect obedience. So the law was good from the perspective that it taught us that we couldn't be saved by law keeping, and that it told us right from wrong.
For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, you shall not covet.
And as I've said before, God will not hold you accountable to anything that He does not teach you or explain or set a standard for. So in no way will God ever condemn anybody for doing something that He never spoke about, that He never provided instructions on. And I know a lot of people today make up extra rules that are not mentioned in the Bible, such as even instrumental music. There is nothing said, positive or negative, about instrumental music in worship. Now, some people say, since it doesn't say you can do it, it is wrong to do it. That's going beyond what the scriptures say, and setting rules and living by the old way of the written code. That is an Old Testament, Old Covenant mindset. We are to serve in the new way of the Spirit that has everything to do with loving your fellow man, treating each other with mercy and kindness and long-suffering and forbearance, not judgmental, self-righteous law-keeping, which happens a lot in churches today.
But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting.
So the opportunity to sin is created by making a law. Whenever you make a law, it creates an opportunity to violate the law. And sin is the transgression or the violation of a law. You cannot sin unless you are violating a law or a commandment established by God, not established by human traditions. So whenever a law is created, such as the one law that Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden, that they could do anything they wanted. They didn't have to wear clothes. They could eat of anything they wanted to eat of, except for that one forbidden tree. There was only one law, and that one law created an opportunity to sin. And when humans have an opportunity to sin, they will almost always, eventually, take that opportunity.
For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law. But when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died.
So I think he's just saying that once I was alive apart from the law. I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about because, Paul was born under the law. He was a Pharisee, and he lived his whole life as a Pharisee, well, until he became a Christian. And it says he was alive apart from the law, because I don't think he was ever apart from the law. So I think he's just using an illustration here that if ever he was under any situation or condition where there was no law, then he had freedom and liberty, and he was alive. Such as, if, for example, if there was no speed limit. If the speed limit was just to drive a reasonable speed, but no specific number, then that gives you freedom and liberty to drive at what you think is safe. But as soon as there is a law, as soon as they put up a sign and a law pass a law that says you can only drive 30 miles an hour, all of a sudden you have an opportunity to fail and to sin and to get a ticket. And I think that's what he's talking about here. If you don't have a law, you have freedom and liberty. And as soon as a law is established, then you have opportunity to sin and die.
I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death.
Now, I don't think that this was a mistake on God's part, that God intended the law of Moses to be perfect and to be the final system of righteousness. I believe the law served the exact intended purpose that God had for it, and that was to convict all under sin and to teach people what sin was. And so, from that perspective, the law may not have been intended to bring life, because it was not the life-giving system. The life-giving system has always been faith in Jesus Christ as Lord. But the law did have a good purpose, and it accomplished its good purpose, and that was to convict all under sin and to teach what sin is.
For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means.
Now, honestly, I understand this question, and I would say probably yes instead of by no means. Did that which is good, the law is good because it accomplished a good purpose that God had for it. Did it become death? Well, yes, it did, because the good intention was to convict all under sin, to teach what sin is and to convict all under sin. But let's see what Paul says.
Nevertheless, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment, sin might become utterly sinful.
So he's pointing out that the law was good in that it convicted me under sin. It convicted all under sin. It helped people to recognize what sin is and it brought about death. So he says, did that which is good become death to me? It looks like the answer is yes to me, because he says, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death. So it looks like that's a contradiction in his argument. Did that which is good become death to me? No, but here it says it used what is good to bring about my death. So there's only a slight difference in how that is phrased there. He's just pointing out the positive aspect, that the law was not a failure. The law actually accomplished what God intended for it. It's just not the same intention that the Jews thought that the law had.
We know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin.
So in the last chapter we talked about slaves. You're either a slave of sin or a slave of righteousness. And Paul is going to expound on that a little bit right here, and it's, I think, very valuable to understand what Paul is talking about. But we need to understand that, being a slave, we need to understand what it means to be a slave and not be offended by being a slave, but to accept that we are humble slaves to whatever dominates our hearts. And it says the law is spiritual and good, created by God for a good purpose, and it accomplished its good purpose. But he says, I am unspiritual. I am a fleshly human, weak in the flesh and susceptible to sin and death. And he was sold, which means that that's against his will. Someone else who owned him sold him as a slave to sin. So, being in the flesh, which is, we all have no choice but to live in the flesh. Physically, we have hearts and blood and brains and that we have to live in. And on this earth that is filled with sin and temptation, and that is enough to convict us all under sin, because we are unspiritual, easily tempted and susceptible to sin and death.
I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good.
So I have a hard time understanding exactly what Paul's weakness would have been. I know he was unmarried, but I don't view him as having these sexual sins, because I think he willingly accepted the unmarried life for the sake of the kingdom. So, whatever his weakness was, he is taking ownership of his sin and his weakness. And he's saying he's not perfect, he's not sinless, and just because he's a Christian and even an inspired apostle, he is not sinless and perfect. And I think that's very valuable to point out, because a lot of times people give these impressions, preachers and self-righteous people give this impression that they're sinless and we should all strive to be sinless. And honestly, I think we should strive to be sinless, but that is not that's not a reasonable expectation. And it's also not the expectation of God that we be sinless. We are to strive to be sinless and strive to put sin out of our life. But we live in the flesh. We are sold as a slave to sin, just as Paul is. And he says he did things that he didn't want to do. And if you don't want to do it, he agrees that the law is good, but yet living in the flesh results in sin from time to time.
As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is in my sinful nature.
So, I know this question is asked often, is just about the nature of man. The phrase total depravity is used to describe the nature of man, and a lot of people have a problem with that phrase or that terminology. I don't have a problem with it. I believe that all humans are sold as a slave to sin, and that we have a sinful nature. Our nature is selfish and sinful. And Paul even says, I know that good does not dwell in me. So Paul did so many good things. But Paul says good does not dwell in him. I think what he's saying is, of his own nature, he is sinful and selfish. But God works through us and performing whatever God's will is, even against our will. Then when we are slaves to righteousness, then God works in us and does things that is against our sinful nature.
For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it.
So Paul even says, I keep on doing these things I don't want to do. So it's an ongoing problem. It's not something that you can say, well, if you're a Christian, then you won't have the same problems over and over. You will get those problems out of your life. Or if you're a Christian, then God will completely purify your heart and only allow you to do good things. We still live on this earth in a fleshly body, and we are susceptible to sin. But as a Christian, we have forgiveness.
So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death?
I mean, I certainly understand when you have the desire to do good, but then you do evil or sin from time to time. It is a war. It is an internal war within your own heart. And Paul is expressing that same thing. And I have a hard time seeing how Paul would even struggle with sin. But he is openly admitting a struggle within himself for good and evil.
Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord.
So he says thanks to Jesus who delivers me, but yet he says that he continues on doing these things that he doesn't want to do. So he has not been completely delivered by Jesus from this internal war, but I think through Jesus, after we die in this earth and after we shed the fleshly bodies, then through Jesus we will completely be delivered from this internal war within ourselves.
So then, I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature a slave to the law of sin.
So I've said even in this chapter and in the chapter before that you're either a slave to sin or a slave to righteousness. But Paul is explaining how we have a dual nature, that we have a spirit and a flesh, and the flesh is bound to the law of sin, is a slave to the law of sin, but the spirit is what matters for our eternal condition, and we have to get our spirit right and work with God in our spirit And hopefully we can not be dominated by the flesh and the law of sin, but that we can dwell and emphasize the life in the Spirit through Jesus Christ. So there's plenty of opportunity to discuss these issues, and I would enjoy reading any of your comments down below.